All right, so I'm gonna do part three of Meltzer's coverage from the January 1984 Observer of the WWF, and this is a huge issue because he's talking about the war is now like official, right? There were shots fired in this war in 1983 with Georgia Championship Wrestling and WWF fighting over Ohio and Western Pennsylvania, and now it is officially begun on a national level with Vince's acquisition of Hulk Hogan, David Schultz, Gene Okerlund, the purchase of KPLR's the time slot that was the St. Louis Wrestling Clubs, and of course Backlund losing the title to the Iron Sheik. So let me continue here. Last time I ended with talking about Meltzer speculating that Hogan would eventually win the title in early summer, late spring at Shea Stadium, and then they would possibly do another Shea Stadium with Andre the Giant challenging Hogan, obviously turning heel, challenging Hogan for the title, which would happen 3 years later, and it would be held in the Pontiac Silverdome. Of course, the rest is history, because that right there was at the time, the largest attendance for pro wrestling, and they say anywhere from 78 to 93,000. So, anyways, Meltzer says Backlund and Hogan teamed up several times on the tapings, January 2nd, January 3rd. Including Hulk's surprise return on the first hour and a bout between Bob and a Samoan. Bob overacted his shoulder neck injury through the third hour on both shows, making it in and out for the next month at least. I guess they were just basically setting up that Backlund would have to bow out of the Madison Square Garden match, which is supposed to be the rematch between Sheik and Backlund on January 23rd. If you get a chance, I thought when I first watched this in the late 80s, I hadn't seen for some reason this promo, because obviously I lived in LA, not New York. And you have Backlund kind of this real solemn interview. And I thought it was a really good interview because it captured really what was happening in changing of the guard. So I believe some real emotion came through in Backlund's interview where he says, he basically didn't want to let down the fans, and it was basically just he had to bow out of the match, and talking about his shoulder, and he wanted to wrestle, but the commission wouldn't let him, something to that effect. And then afterwards, Morocco was interviewed, and Albano comes out and they mock Backlund, which I thought, that was funny too. That was great. And then Hogan comes in. He was the last interview on that little segment, and he's just fired up, man. That like interview segment, where they're announcing the next Garden show, Backlund bowing out, and you have Morocco, then Hogan comes in all fired up. It just is perfect. You're seeing the changing of the guard, the changing of an era. I was a big Bob Backlund fan. I know a lot of people don't like Backlund. A lot of it's because of his personality, kind of they always mock him with the howdy doody thing, but I liked him. And I started watching wrestling in the beginning of '83 when Backlund was really, his reign as champion. 1983 was not like considered a good year for him by fans, by experts, whatever. But I liked him. I thought he represented the promotion well. Like if you're gonna portray wrestling as a shoot sport, like a pro version of the amateur, Bob Backlund he's the perfect ideal for that. And I enjoyed his work. I enjoyed his matches. I thought, and he was a stud, man. He was like one of those guys that clean cut All-American, but strong as an ox. Anyways, but it was time to change, obviously. And what's crazy is when Backlund, showed up in Pro Wrestling USA, and I got Pro Wrestling USA here in LA, at least right after WrestleMania 1. And then Backlund showed up. I was kind of excited about Backlund being in Pro Wrestling USA. And so he wrestled he feuded with Larry Zbyszko over the Americas title. He had a match with Rick Martel for the AWA World title. I don't think that's on tape anywhere. But the fact is that wrestling had moved on from Bob Backlund, right? Wrestling had moved on from him. Backlund was super popular in the Northeast, but this was a new era. And it's kind of like Backlund was that unfortunate sacrificial lamb of sacrificing the old way of doing things. And now this is a new era. Anyways, so they teamed up several times. That's Hulk and Backlund. Boston and Capitol Center in Los Angeles will all have battle royals this next month. Now, that's big in LA because LA had their famous annual battle royals in January of each year. That was a big annual event for LA. So I think Vince is doing that because it's obviously battle royals are traditionally a big draw in LA. He says, I'm told WWF will draw the first sellout at the Olympic Auditorium on January 28th in several years. By the way, the Los Angeles Sports Arena, where WWF had been running the past year, is trying to bring in wrestling on its own. So I guess there was a time where, because when WWF came in to LA in early '83, late '82, they were running the sports arena, but they'd also do the Olympic. So I don't know why the switching back and forth for a bit until they finally settled on the sports arena. I don't know, maybe it was the rent. I don't know. Obviously, when Hook McMahon first comes into LA, he has to build up a crowd. Now, having been to both places and the Olympic Auditorium all the way back in '84, and having been at the sports arena for fans that are not from LA, to tell you the difference, the Olympic Auditorium is smaller. So I think it's 11,000 sellout, and the sports arena, I think, was 16. Sports arena is where the Clippers played USC Trojans basketball. Olympic Auditorium is known for roller derby, boxing, wrestling. Obviously, the Olympic Auditorium was a more traditional arena, more old school, more of a authentic environment, I guess. More of a it's like one of those arenas, has the nooks and crannies, has a lot of character. That's what I say, more character. Sports arena was just like a very basic arena where you would have basketball and stuff like that. Very basic arena. But when I was there at the sports arena, the Olympic Auditorium was hot. By the time I was there for Snooker Piper, it was hot. When I went to the sports arena, and I've been to the sports arena several times for wrestling, the crowds were always into it, man. The crowds were always into it. Now, I think later they did some LA house shows on the sports channel. And when you watch it, it just the sports arena doesn't really it just looks like a run-of-the-mill arena. It looks like a run-of-the-mill generic arena. But when you were there, the crowds were always hot. It was always like a really good environment at the LA Sports Arena. But the Olympic Auditorium, nothing beat that. That was just exciting. But by the time I went, it was older. It was, kind of beat up, both in bad neighborhoods. I have a funny story about the LA Sports Arena, something that happened in 1985. Maybe I'll tell it at the end of this thing. Let's keep reading. By the way, the LA Sports Arena, where the WWF had been running the past years, trying to bring in wrestling on its own. So I guess there was a point where the LA Sports Arena was trying to bring their own promotion in. The directors say they're negotiating with a group out of Minneapolis, obviously the AWA. Who would have known the AWA was going to try to come in and run the sports arena? Now, they did end up coming to run the Olympic Auditorium in 1985, and that's the one regret I have. I wish I would have gone to that card. I believe it was in September, October of '85. I guess Jeff Walton, who famously worked for Mike LaBelle when LA had their own NWA promotion, brought in the AWA. They did a battle royal. I believe Stan Hansen won that battle royal. I remember watching AWA wrestling at the time on KTLA Channel 5, the Pro Wrestling USA show, and they would do interviews for it. I wish I would have gone. I think that was their only shot at the Olympic, and then afterwards they would come to the Anaheim Convention Center, but it wasn't like a regular thing. And another thing I regret, in 1988, I think Jerry Lawler, by the time he was champion, he was going to defend against Kurt Hennig at the Anaheim Convention Center. I think only 100 fans went. I would have went, though. I wish I would have went. But anyways, so I like what Meltzer says here. Look what he says. He says, stay out of this one, Vern. Worry about your home. Because Meltzer, remember, this is that issue. The war's been declared. And Meltzer knew that the first target of Vince was going to be the AWA in their market, because he got the AWA's biggest stars and their announcer, Gene Okerlund. Yep. And Minneapolis was one of the first intense battlegrounds of the wrestling war between Vince and Vern. The Battle Royals may not go through the WWF rubber stamp promotion as in the past. On 12/17 in Baltimore, with the winner of the Battle Royal set to wrestle Backlund for the title, Tony Atlas won the Royal. Backlund and Atlas wrestled 16 minutes, and I was told it was worse than you would think, which is medically impossible if both of their hearts were beating. Anyway, Bob headbutted Tony in the groin accidentally on an attempted leapfrog. Tony was unable to continue, but Bob refused to accept the win. So it was a babyface match. In promos in Boston, Morocco wished Backlund the best of luck against Sheik and hurled several insults at the Iranian, while in Washington, D.C., Slaughter wished President Reagan and Nancy a Merry Christmas and vowed if he meets Sheik, Sheik will be blowing bubbles. I do remember Morocco insulting the Sheik on Victory Magazine, the little segment that was right after Buddy Rogers' corner, right before Piper's Pit. I remember Morocco, and I was surprised he was insulting the Sheik. So I think what it was, I don't think they were planning. I mean, maybe they were planning to turn Morocco babyface at one point, but I think it was more of they were trying to get the Sheik over as this and they were playing on the anti-Iranian sentiment from a few years earlier, the Iranian hostage crisis. But obviously, Slaughter, they're prepping for a babyface turn. Meltzer says, I almost forgot an impressive newcomer, Jose Luis Rivera, who used to wrestle as Mac Rivera. I'm told he looks pretty good. The Moondogs may be on the way. WWF plans to run 4 shows per night in the coming months. I guess at this time, they're running like 2 shows from what I understand. So they were planning to run, and they did. They ended up running 3 to 4 cards a night, I think at the peak. At WWF's peak, from what I understand, and I think it was around maybe 1988, they were running like 734 shows a year, I think. And this accounts probably, people started noticing in 1986, really, really lethargic work rate among WWF wrestlers. And they did have some good workers. Obviously they did. Steamboat, who probably always worked good. I don't think it affected him. Santana, who else? Savage, obviously. But a lot because of the travel. I mean, these guys had to be worn out on the road, and it showed up in their work rate. But yeah, I think at their peak, I think it was like something like 735 shows a year. I might even be underestimating that. Has to affect the work rate, right? Because traveling is brutal like that every day. He says, the WWF plans to run 4 shows per night in the coming months, which is spreading things rather thin, but with this talent pool, they'll get away with it. Yeah, and what's interesting, right? If you watch the Madison Square Garden cards in 1984, a lot of the cards are loaded. Like they have a lot of the top guys are there, a lot of big matches, from the middle card to the upper card. When you go to 1985, after WrestleMania 1, you notice the MSG cards are not that loaded. Maybe a couple matches of top guys, and then a few other top guys that are wrestling kind of lesser wrestlers. The cards from 84, MSG compared to 85, the cards at 85 pale in comparison. Because I think that's as Vince is progressing through his expansion, he's starting to add more shows per night, and then he needs to spread his wrestlers out. So he says, Buddy Rogers slipped in the MSG dressing room, 11/21, which is why he canceled a series of matches as Jimmy Snuka's partner, causing old Arnie Skolin to sub against Morocco and Albano. Rogers has been fired and has sued McMahon, right? So that's why you see in December, it's Arnold Skolin and Snuka, which is basically the blow off the Snuka-Morocco feud against Albano and Morocco. Again, a lot of things are changing. Now, one of the things I'm going to mention that I notice, Piper talked about this, that the match between Snuka and Morocco, even though it got Snuka over big, it kind of was a way to start minimizing his importance to bring in, because McMahon knew he was going to usher Hogan in. And I kind of believe that because if you look at the next month at MSG, even though it's not on videotape, Snuka's wrestling Slaughter. Apparently Snuka hit or missed Slaughter with the splash. Slaughter got him in the Cobra and time ran out. That's kind of putting Slaughter over. They're preparing for the big babyface turn for Slaughter, I guess. but it's kind of further minimizing Snuka. Because I think McMahon knew in order to get Hogan over fully as the number one guy, he had to kind of bring Snuka down because Snuka was the number one guy. I mean, Snuka's popularity was very grassroots. Where Hogan's, I don't like to use the word manufactured because he was legitimately popular, but Hogan's popularity was more of a marketing machine. And that's not bad, but that's how I see it. That's how I've seen other people mention it. Other people like Rocky Johnson's talked about that. Now, one of the things I notice, further proof of the minimizing of Snuka on purpose by McMahon to bring in Hogan as the indisputable number one babyface. Because Snuka was that from the time he turned babyface through the end of '83. Hogan wins the title from the Iron Sheik January 23rd. Huge, huge pop. To me, that moment is just, it's an awesome moment in pro wrestling history. It's in one of the greatest moments sports-wise, even of the 80s. The match right after that is Jimmy Snuka. And I think it was against Mr. Fuji. Because I just watched it a couple months ago. It was against either Mr. Fuji or one of the Samoans. I don't remember. But think about this. The crowd just exploded for Hulk Hogan's championship win over the Iron Sheik. The new era is here. Hulkamania has arrived in the WWF, and now it's going to go nationwide. The very next match, and you know what they say, once you get this crowd to this pinnacle where they explode and they pop, they're not gonna be up for the next couple of matches. They have to wind down, right? So what does McMahon do? He schedules Jimmy Snuka right after Hogan's match to wrestle, I think, in Mr. Fuji or one of the Samoans. And the crowd is dead. Which never happens for a Jimmy Snuka match. The crowd is dead. I think Snuka even did the Superfly. I'm not positive. But, and people popped a little bit. The crowd was flat because they had just experienced a huge, huge, momentous moment in pro wrestling history. So now everything the rest of the card is just going to be kind of anticlimactic. So I think what Piper said was absolutely right. That October 1983 was the beginning of Vince trying to minimize Snuka so he can bring in Hogan as the number one indisputable babyface. It was weird the way it happened because Snuka's like this number one babyface in the WWF, the number one babyface, and it's almost overnight, out of nowhere, that Hogan's the number one guy. That Hogan's now the people's choice. Now, what's interesting in reading Jimmy Snuka's book, Snuka talked about an incident, and I know this match is on TV, on several of the WWF tapes. It's Snuka. It was, I guess, the week after WrestleMania was Snuka and Hulk Hogan against Morocco and Cowboy Bob Orton at the Boston Garden. Snuka talked about this in his book. Snuka made an interesting comment. He said that Hulk Hogan knew that he wasn't going to be so Hulk Hogan knew he couldn't be the number one guy as long as Snuka was there. And I'll say this. Snuka was over huge with fans. Even after Hogan won the title, Snuka was over huge. Okay? Snuka didn't come in with music. His popularity was really grassroots. And Hogan's been known to be insecure. Now, Snuka's career as a top guy was winding down. He was older. Hogan was going to be the number one guy. But Hogan's been known to be insecure about people that are at that number two slot. Ricky Steamboat, Roddy Piper. And Piper was babyface. Ricky Steamboat. So Snuka said that there was a spot in the match where I guess Hogan was in the ring fighting, I don't know if it was Orton Morocco, and then Snuka was outside the ring. I don't know if he was fighting Orton Morocco, but either way, Hogan was in the ring. Snuka came out and he's brawling with one of the heels. And apparently the the fans were focusing on Snuka's brawling outside the ring, and they were popping for it and not paying attention to Hogan. And Snuka said in his book that Hogan stormed into the dressing room, pissed at Snuka, like saying, "What are you trying to upstage me?" And then Snuka, he said he just like ignored it. And Snuka said, yeah, Hogan knew he couldn't be the man in the dressing room as long as he knew Snuka was there. And, once Snuka left, that was the closest threat to Hogan's popularity was Snuka. Because Slaughter had already left. Slaughter, I would say for the first half of 1984, Slaughter was the number 2 babyface. But then once his feud with Iron Sheik ended, Snuka's with Piper's was bubbling up. And then Snuka in the second half of 84 was the number 2. He went back to number 2 babyface. He was the number 2 babyface at the time of WrestleMania 1. Okay. And then I think he was going to lose that spot to Paul Orndorff because they were going to turn Paul right after WrestleMania 1. And then, if Snuka had not left the WWF, I think he would have been eclipsed by Orndorff, at least for a time. Because Orndorff, as a babyface was the new model car, right? But then he kind of leveled off. They turned him back heel. Now Snuka talks in the book that event they were planning to turn him heel and have him main event Hogan. I don't know about WrestleMania 2, but have him like feud with Hogan. I don't know how true that is, but I can see that happening. I can see Hogan wanting that to get Snuka to be heel instead of face, to eliminate some competition. And then, once Hogan, the formula was in the WWF, once Hogan beat you kind of were on the downward out. But anyways, let's get back to the Observer. He says there's more. Rumor has it WWF talking with Spiros Arion in Greece to head up operations in Australia. McMahon Sr., while in Japan, sold an arena tape to one of the networks for $20,000 and talked with Hisashi Shinma, the deposed brains behind the New Japan success story in Japan, about promoting in the Orient. Apparently, if all goes well in this venture, Shinma has told McMahon he can lure Satoru Sayama, the original Tiger Mask, out of retirement. So I guess they wanted to expand into Japan too. That didn't happen, at least at that time. So, I guess he wanted to compete with All Japan and New Japan. Meltzer then says WWF has canceled further shows in San Diego. 12-4, December 4th drew only 1,800 fans, and the action there was poor because they wrestle in a boxing ring. Thus, the wrestlers can't take any real falls. They eventually, obviously they stayed in San Diego. I don't know if how long they were gone from San Diego, but they eventually went back and obviously were successful. January 28th, Los Angeles Battle Royal, which has John Tolis, who was a big LA guy in the territory, LA territory. Pat Patterson, San Francisco territory. Santana, Atlas, Sharp, Alpha and Sika, Sheik, Slaughter, Andre, and Hogan was to be the last California card if crowds don't pick up, but they certainly will. I guess crowds were down in LA, but then Meltzer saying they'll pick up because now they have Hogan, they're Piper, and so he's predicting to pick up, and he was right. Baltimore runs January 28th, also with Backlund versus Orndorff, Snuka versus Morocco, Superstar versus Johnson. It'll be interesting to see how well Backlund versus Orndorff draws. And that's his WWF section. I'll probably cover also from this from this issue. I'll probably do World Class, Mid-South, definitely AWA. These Observer newsletters, I'm reading through them again. They're awesome, man. It's just priceless seeing the views of someone who wasn't just a hardcore fan, but actually had obviously some type of connection behind the scenes, at this time. Anyways, guys, have a good day. All right, bye.